So today we're going to fly the ILS to runway 11 in San Luis Obispo, California. But before we jump into that procedure, just a quick recap on what we covered in the previous video. Remember, we talked about the importance of speed and configuration gates. Here on our initial approach fix, or vectors to final, right in front of our final approach fix, and then as we begin the missed approach, if we need that. We talked about the importance of RNAV flight plan management. And we talked about the importance of autopilot mode awareness. And in today's flight, you're going to see us put all of that into place. But to emphasize how important this is, yesterday we got a phone call from a retired Airbus training captain who now teaches in the general aviation world. And he was so excited that we were teaching these principles because these are principles that commercial operators use in transport category aircraft, and they need to be taught and used in general aviation aircraft. Now, when I learned how to fly under IFR, we didn't have RNAV systems yet. They weren't certified. And so applying these principles, it was a little more difficult because we simply had independent NavCom stacks. We were twisting and setting up radios as we went. And our autopilot systems were fairly rudimentary. But nowadays, we're all essentially equipped with RNAV avionics with a complete flight plan system. So we're essentially flying within FMS. And our autopilot systems have become incredibly advanced, which also means they've got a lot more functions and they become more complicated. And they're not just in aircraft like a Cirrus, we also see them in the RV-8s that are stationed at our home airport. It's unbelievable the amount of technology that has entered general aviation, but when you're using it, you really need to apply those standardized principles, essentially the exact same principles that the commercial operators use. And that's what we're going to do today. Okay, so to set you up for this procedure, we're on a flight from Salinas, California via Victor 248 over the Paso Robles VOR and then into San Luis Obispo. And we're going to join the flight on the Victor Airway right about the point that we can pick up ATIS.
This morning we're on an IFR flight from Salinas, California along Victor 248 to San Luis Obispo. The weather in San Luis Obispo is low. In our departure weather brief, the ceiling at San Luis Obispo was 200 feet AGL, and they reported 1 statute mile of visibility. So we're going to need an approach to get down, and the approach that we're going to use is the ILS to runway 11. We'll be flying our final approach segment at 100 knots indicated, so we'd fly to Category B minimums today, which means we'll use a 398-foot MSL decision altitude, which puts us 200 feet above the runway's touchdown zone elevation. So right at the bottom of that reported overcast layer. And it requires 1/2 statute mile of flight visibility. So we've got a little bit of margin between the reported ground visibility of 1 statute mile and the 1/2 statute mile of flight visibility that we need to land. That top line of minimums does have an asterisk next to the ILS runway 11, and that's because those minimums require a higher than standard climb gradient. If you take a look at the missed approach instructions, it does say that those minimums, with the asterisk, require a minimum climb gradient of 210 feet per nautical mile to 1,160 feet MSL. If we can't meet that climb gradient, then we could use the line of minimums below that without the asterisk. And those would assume the standard missed approach climb gradient of 200 feet per nautical mile. So honestly, not much of a change. And our calculated climb gradient at 1,160 feet MSL today, at a cruise climb of 120 knots indicated, is 585 feet per nautical mile. So well above that required climb gradient. This procedure gives us the best option to get down in San Luis Obispo. But if we can't land there, we could always head somewhere like Paso Robles, where the weather is good VFR, and we've got more than enough fuel. There are 3 initial approach fixes on the ILS runway 11. We have one at Oxun, one at Crete, and one at Frams. Now the one at Oxun makes the most sense for us. There's a feeder route from the Paso Robles FORTAC that takes us to the Oxun initial approach fix, and that initial approach segment is labeled no PT, so we wouldn't have to fly the hold and low procedure turn. If we start the procedure at Crete, then we would be required to fly the hold and low procedure turn unless we are cleared straight in. The third initial approach fix at Frams is over the Pacific, so it really wouldn't apply to us. Though if you were to fly it, you would also be able to skip the hold and low procedure turn because it too is labeled no PT. So for us, I think the Oxun initial approach fix works the best. Now honestly, I think we're going to get vectors to the final approach course from Santa Barbara approach, which also means that we would not need to fly that hold and low procedure turn. But I always like to load an instrument approach into my RNAV flight plan using an initial approach fix and never really using vectors to final. And that way, if air traffic control does send me to one of the fixes on the approach, even after they started giving me some vectors, I have that waypoint loaded in my database. Otherwise, now I'm close to the procedure and I'm trying to reload an approach. And that really adds to my workload. So, even though we expect vectors to the final approach course, we will load the procedure starting at the Paso Robles FORTAC, and then that flight plan will include the feeder route that takes us to the Oxun initial approach fix. So if air traffic control does vector us on the final, where are we going to join that final approach course? Normally, ATC will vector us to intercept the final approach course just outside of their approach gate. And the approach gate is an imaginary point that is located generally 1 nautical mile outside of the procedure's final approach fix. So in this case, air traffic control would place that approach gate about 1 nautical mile outside of JAMPO. Our actual final approach fix is on glide slope at the published glide slope intercept altitude, in this case 2,400 feet MSL, or lower if directed by air traffic control, but that occurs right about JAMPO. So I would expect to intercept the final approach course in between JAMPO and creep. And that means if air traffic control starts vectoring us to intercept on that leg, we can simply activate the leg between JAMPO and creep in our flight plan. And then from there, our avionics flight plan will sequence perfectly. So as I said, our final approach fix is on glide slope at the published glide slope intercept altitude of 2,400 feet MSL, or lower if assigned by air traffic control, and that occurs right about JAMPO. JAMPO is the final approach fix for the non-precision localizer only approach, which we'd fly if the glide slope on the ground was inoperative, or if our glide slope unit in the air didn't work. But considering the localizer's category B minimums only get you down to 1,222 feet above the runway's touchdown zone elevation, the localizer only approach would be of zero help today, considering our ceilings. You also heard me say that our final approach fix happens about JAMPO, even though that lightning bolt points to JAMPO. And the reason for that is just simply a little bit of barometric error. Unless the temperature is perfectly standard, and those pressure levels are at that perfect 1 inch per 1,000 foot spacing, you're not actually going to be at exactly 2,400 feet on your altimeter when you're on glide slope over JAMPO. Remember, the glide slope itself is fixed in space and it never moves. On the other hand, the pressure levels used by our barometric altimeters do lower and raise with temperature. So really, your final approach fix is going to happen very close to JAMPO, but not exactly at it. So after we cross our ILS final approach fix of 2,400 feet on glide slope, we'll fly the glide slope down to our decision altitude, which is our missed approach point. And that gets us 200 feet above the runway's touchdown zone elevation, and we require 1/2 statute mile of flight visibility to land. There is one thing that is unique about this procedure. If you take a look at the notes, it says that an autopilot coupled approach is not authorized below 677 feet MSL. Now my guess is that something could possibly interfere with either the glide slope or the localizer. And if your autopilot is coupled to it, it will try to keep that needle centered. And so if we get any localizer or glide slope scalloping or wobble, that could be a little violent. The advantage of using a flight director and flying it by hand is that we can just even that out, allow the glide slope to deviate a little bit while remaining within the center of those deviations and essentially holding the true glide slope all the way down to the runway. Okay, so we're going to start by picking up the ATIS. From there, we're going to load the procedure into our RNAV flight plan. I'll brief it, and we should be all set to go.
Landing and departing runway 11. Advise on initial contact with information. San Luis Tower information whiskey 1256 weather observation. Wind 200 at 4. Visibility 1 3/4. Mist. Ceiling 200 overcast. Temperature 12, dew point 11. Altimeter 2987. ILS approaching use. Landing and departing runway 11. Advise on initial contact with information.
So we'll load this into the RNAV flight plan. We'll hit procedure, then select approach. The ILS runway 11 is the first procedure, and we'll start the procedure over the Paso Robles FORTAC, PRB, which allows us to load both the feeder route to the initial approach fix Oxun, and then the entire ILS instrument approach procedure after Oxun. And we'll set our baro minimums. We're flying final at 100 knots indicated, so we'll use category B minimums. So a 398-foot decision altitude. And that rounds up to 400 feet and checks. And we don't want to change the active leg of our flight plan yet. We're still navigating the airway. We just want to add this instrument approach procedure onto the very end of our flight plan. We'll hit load. That'll add this instrument approach to the very end of our flight plan. And now we'll compare the loaded procedure in our flight plan against our chart. And after the San Luis Obispo Airport, we have the ILS runway 11 in San Luis Obispo. And the flight plan's procedure starts with the Paso Robles VORTAC. Here it shows a crossing altitude of 5,000 feet, but if air traffic control assigns a crossing altitude, then we can enter it in there. From there we have our feeder route from Paso Robles to the Oxun initial approach fix, with a minimum altitude of 4,800 feet MSL, which matches the chart. Then we've got our initial approach segment from Oxun to Creep, and that shows that minimum altitude of 4,000 feet, which matches the no PT segment on our instrument approach chart. And from Creep, we head to Jampo, and you can see our glide slope intercept altitude at 2,400 feet there. And you'll notice that Jampo is labeled FAF for a final approach fix, but our real final approach fix is on glide slope at our published glide slope intercept altitude of 2,400 feet. But the RNAV flight plan needs a fixed point to cycle onto the final approach segment, and so in this case, it's using Jampo. Then you can see RWY that's listed as our missed approach point and as a flyover waypoint. That's that little cross circle that you see there. We know that this point is at the runway's threshold because it's titled RW11. If it wasn't, then it would have a standard 5-letter name. Remember, our real missed approach point is decision altitude today, 398 feet MSL. But again, our RNAV flight plan needs a fixed point to begin the missed approach segment, and it's going to use the runway threshold to do that. From there, we have our missed approach procedure, which is a straight out climb to 1,000 feet, then a right turn to a heading of 215 to intercept the 126-degree radial from the Morro Bay VORTAC. We track that to the Morro Bay VORTAC, and we will hold. And we'll continue our climb to 3,300 feet MSL. So, looking at this flight plan and looking at our chart, all of the segments and the altitudes match. So, our RNAV flight plan is basically a perfect depiction of this conventional ILS approach. So now let's brief the approach. We're flying the ILS runway 11 into San Luis Obispo County Regional in San Luis Obispo, California. Chart date of last revision is 25051, and we can use that number to let us know that we're both looking at the exact same chart, regardless of when it was issued. Our final approach course guidance is provided by the KSBP localizer 109.7. We already have that tuned into nav1. Hasn't identified yet because we're not in the service volume, but we will verify that prior to intercepting our final approach course. We do have one note that applies to us today. Autopilot coupled approach is not authorized below 677 feet MSL, so we'll switch from using the autopilot to the flight director once we are established on the localizer, but prior to intercepting the glide slope. There are no NOTAMs that apply to us today. We have ATIS tuned in to COM2 active, and we have information whiskey. And I have granted COM2 standby. Right now we're talking to Oakland Center. That's in COM1 active. I do have Santa Barbara approach in COM1 standby. Once we switch over to Santa Barbara approach, I'll set San Luis Tower into COM1 standby. We are expecting vectors to the final approach course today, which will most likely intercept in between Creep and Jampo. However, I do have the full procedure loaded into the RNAV flight plan, starting with the Paso Robles VOR and the feeder route that takes us to the Oxun initial approach fix. We'll slow to our initial approach speed of 120 knots indicated and flaps clean on our base vector, or if they don't give us one, on our intercept vector for our final approach course. If we do fly the full procedure today, then we will cross Oxun, the initial approach fix, at 120 knots and flaps clean. When the glide slope reaches 1/2 scale deflection, we'll slow to 100 knots indicated and set flaps to 50%, which is our final approach configuration. Our final approach fix today is on glide slope at the published altitude of 2,400 feet or lower if directed by air traffic control. We're going to fly final at 100 knots, which means we'll use Category B minimums today. Our decision altitude is 398 feet MSL, which puts us 200 feet above the runway's touchdown zone elevation, and that is cued on our primary flight display at 400 feet MSL. And we require 1/2 statute mile of flight visibility to land. ATIS Whiskey reported ceilings at 200 feet AGL, so right at our decision height, and visibility of 1 3/4 statute mile, which is reasonably above our required flight visibility. Visual aids on the runway today. Runway 11 is a Mauser approach lighting system, a VASI on the left side, and high-intensity runway lighting. It also has a displace threshold. And San Luis Obispo is tower controlled, so we do not need to activate lighting today. If we don't meet the requirements to land today, our missed approach procedure is a straight-out climb to 1,000 feet, then a climbing right turn to 3,300 feet MSL on a heading of 215, intercepting the Morro Bay Vortac radial 126, and tracking that inbound to the Morro Bay Vortac to hold. And we'll continue to climb in the hold to 3,300 feet MSL. If we do need to execute the missed approach procedure, once we make that turn to our intercept heading, we can switch to RNAV-based navigation, and I will engage the autopilot once we are stable climbing and clean. And our line of minimums does require a missed approach climb gradient of 210 feet per nautical mile to 1,160 feet MSL, and our calculated climb gradient of 585 feet per nautical mile significantly exceeds that. Threats today. We do have mountains over the coast, and of course the Pacific off to our west. There are 4 minimum safe altitude sectors today based off the Morro Bay Vortac. We'll fly the approach in the 4,700 and 5,300 foot MSL sectors, and if we end up executing the missed approach, we'll enter the 3,700 foot MSL sector. Runway 11 has 5,300 feet available for landing. Our ground roll today at flaps 50% is 1,228 feet. Taking out about 1,000 feet for our glide slope intercept just after the aiming point markers, we should have roughly 4,300 feet remaining, so our ground roll is well within our runway available. We're parking at ACI Jet today, so we'll exit the runway to the left, and we'll talk to ground control for taxi clearance in. And on the east side of the airport, we do not have any runways that we would potentially cross while taxiing. Any questions? Okay, so we've loaded the procedure. We've briefed the approach. Right now we're just navigating the airway into Paso Robles. I would expect at some point in time soon we'll get a handoff from Oakland Center to Santa Barbara Approach. And then when we contact Santa Barbara Approach, we'll let them know that we have information whiskey and we will request vectors to the ILS runway 11. ATIS whiskey tells us to expect the ILS, but it doesn't tell us to expect vectors. So requesting vectors when we contact approach control keeps everything clear so they know exactly what we want.
Cirrus 216 Bravo Delta, proceed direct creep.
Direct creep, Cirrus 216 Bravo Delta. Okay, we'll select creep in our flight plan and hit direct. And yep, that's where we want to go, creep. So we'll activate. And then we will confirm that the active leg in our flight plan is actually going to creep, which it is. And that our autopilot is in GPS mode and altitude hold mode at 5,000 feet, taking us to creep.
Cirrus 6 Bravo Delta, contact Santa Barbara Approach 127.72.
Santa Barbara 127.72, Cirrus 6 Bravo Delta. Okay, we'll switch Santa Barbara Approach into COM1 active. Santa Barbara Approach, Cirrus 216 Bravo Delta, level 5,000, information whiskey, requesting vectors ILS runway 11.
Cirrus 216 Bravo Delta, good morning. Santa Barbara Approach, expect vectors ILS runway 11.
Good morning and roger, Cirrus 216 Bravo Delta. Okay, now we know that we should expect vectors to the ILS runway 11, and we won't have to fly the entire procedure. But our route itself has not changed. We're still flying direct creep, so we're not going to do anything to our flight plan yet. What I will do is set tower 124.0 into COM1 standby. Keeps us ahead of the airplane. And I can see if our localizer in nav1 has identified yet, which it hasn't. But that's expected because we are outside of the service volume. But we'll check it again as we get closer to the localizer.
Cirrus 216 Bravo Delta, flighting 220, vector for the ILS, have traffic departing. In about 2 minutes, we'll have you turned in for the ILS soon.
Right heading 220, Cirrus 216 Bravo Delta. We'll bug heading 220 and clear right, make sure there's no one out there. And now we'll switch over to heading mode. So we're in heading mode and altitude hold mode at 5,000 feet. Now we're being vectored for the approach, so we can change the active leg in our flight plan. And that means that we want to activate the leg between creep and JAMPO. So we'll select JAMPO, hit menu, activate leg, make sure that's the one we want, creep to JAMPO, and activate it. Now when we take a look at our active flight plan line, you'll see that we're navigating from creep to JAMPO. Okay, now I'm on my base vector, so I'm going to slow to 120 knots, flaps clean. 120 knots in level flight takes me about 51% power. That's what I'm going to set, and then I'll adjust my power as necessary. You can also see that we are now in the localizer service volume and that it is identified because ISBP shows up in our NAV1 frequency box. So this means the avionics have heard that Morse code identifier on the frequency and it matches ISBP. You can also see, looking at our CDI, that our primary CDI is still magenta, navigating with RNAV, but we have a white localizer preview, which shows us our localizer's actual deflection. And this is very common for lots of avionics systems. Because you need to navigate a localizer using raw localizer data and not RNAV, they will show you both RNAV course guidance and localizer course guidance as you're approaching a localizer. And then it will switch over into pure localizer guidance, what we call green needles, because conventional nav aids are traditionally shown in green as we intercept the final approach course. If you were flying with traditional analog CDIs, this is when I would switch my number one CDI over from RNAV to the localizer and glide slope, because from here on out, really that's the guidance that matters.
Sierra 6 Bravo Delta, descend and maintain 3000.
Descend and maintain 3000, Sierra 6 Bravo Delta. So we'll select 3000 feet set, and engage vertical speed mode. 700 feet a minute should get us down by the localizer. And right now we are in heading mode and vertical speed mode at 700 feet a minute down with our selected altitude armed.
Sierra 6 Bravo Delta, 8 miles from Jompo, fly heading 130, maintain 3000 until established on the localizer, cleared ILS runway 11 approach.
Left heading 130, 3000 till established, cleared ILS runway 11 approach, Sierra 6 Bravo Delta. Okay, so we set 130 and clear left as we start that turn. And now that we have been cleared for the approach, I'm going to arm approach mode. So we're in heading mode and vertical speed mode with our localizer, selected altitude, and glide slope armed. And now that our localizer needle has come off the wall, you can see the avionics have automatically switched our CDI number 1 from RNAV magenta needles to the localizer green needles. And on my intercept, I always re-verify that that nav radio is tuned and identified, and it is ISBP. And that identifier is green now, which tells us that our CDI is using nav1. Okay, now our localizer is capturing, and we are in localizer mode and vertical speed mode 700 feet a minute with our selected altitude and glide slope armed, and we are tracking our localizer inbound. We are established on the localizer in between Creep and Jampo, so we could descend down to 2,400 feet, but you can see our glide slope has already come off full-scale deflection. And honestly, we're about ready to level at 3,000 feet. So instead of spinning that altitude bug down and making some rapid changes, I'm just going to level off at 3,000 feet, capture the glide slope from our ATC assigned altitude, and then fly that down. I think that gives us a smaller chance to make an error. And this doesn't change our final approach fix. Our final approach fix will happen as we pass through 2,400 feet on the glide slope. So we're leveling 3,000 feet, and we are in localizer mode and altitude hold mode at 3,000 feet with our glide slope armed. And now that I'm established, I'll also switch from autopilot to flight director. Okay, so our glide slope is about half scale deflection. We'll go ahead and set power for 100 knots and flaps to 50%, which is our final approach configuration. And flaps are at 50%. It'll take about 41% power to hold 100 knots in level flight with our flaps at 50%. So that's where I'm going to start, and then I can adjust my power from there. Now that we're configured and stable, I will select my missed approach top altitude of 3,300 feet MSL and 3,300 feet MSL set.
Sierra 6 Bravo Delta, if you can note the tops and bases, forward that to tower, contact San Luis Tower 124.0.
We'll go on over to tower, Sierra 6 Bravo Delta. We'll swap tower into COM 1, listen to make sure the frequency is clear. San Luis Tower, Sierra 216 Bravo Delta, ILS runway 11.
Sirius 216 Bravo Delta, San Luis Tower, runway 11, clear to land.
Clear to land, runway 11, Sirius 216 Bravo Delta. And you can see we've got a little bit of sinking air here, so I'm going to bring my power up to 45%. You can see I'm pitched up fairly high for level flight, but still keeping 100 knots in level flight, holding 3,000 feet. And we're capturing that glide slope. I'm going to set power to about 26%. We'll need a 500 to 600 foot a minute descent to hold this 3-degree glide slope here at 100 knots. I said that should be about 26% power, and we are in localizer mode and glide slope mode. I'd expect a little bit of a wind shift as we get close to these cloud tops. That's pretty common, so we might see a little bit of a pitch or a power change as we enter the clouds. So right now I'm keeping my yellow pitch bars centered in those magenta command bars. That's holding my glide slope. And then I'm adjusting my power as necessary to hold 100 knots indicated. $1,000 to minimums. $500 to minimums. Now as I approach my minimums here, I'm dividing my time between my instruments and quick looks outside to see if I've got that runway environment in sight, but nothing yet. 100 to minimums. And I can see the approach lighting system, so we're continuing, and we can descend down to 100 feet above touchdown zone elevation, and I have the runway in sight. We're continuing to land. Now I'm using the VASIs on the side of the runway to help manage my visual glide path as I descend down. Now I'm going to bring my power back here to cross the threshold at 85 knots for a 50% flap landing. And I'm pitching up as I do that, and I'm using my VASI to help keep me on the glide slope visually. As we bring the power out, we're going to bring that pitch up. And we're going to flare, and we're down. And we don't need to brake aggressively here. We're just going to use aerodynamic braking. Keep the stick full back.
Okay, so you can see, number one, how our speed and configuration points worked out perfectly along this procedure. And those aren't doctored numbers. That's actually what we used to fly the procedure. We had a little bit of sinking air there right as we intercepted that glide slope. But then from there, honestly, the ILS was a breeze to fly. You can also see how setting up the entire procedure in our RNAV flight plan worked out perfectly for us, because even though we were getting vectors onto the final approach course, before the vectors, they asked us to proceed direct creep, and that was loaded into our flight plan. And then it was easy to transition from that vector onto our final approach course. All we needed to do was activate the leg at Jampo. Now, the amazing thing about all these new modern RNAV avionics systems is, well, they have a ton of features. They all use essentially the same basic flight plan concept, and that is the linear flight plan, where you have essentially slots for a departure, the en route phase, an arrival, and your approach. And Garmin does this fantastically well across all of their different systems, whether it's an original system like our G1000 or whether you've got an upgrade system. They all use this same linear flight plan concept. And when we meet people who are confused about how these systems work under IFR, one of the biggest things they don't understand is that concept of a linear flight plan. And that's something we really focus on because our light aircraft now are approaching transport category aircraft. Now, they don't have nearly the same amount of power or redundant systems, but their avionics, in many cases, are more capable than airline avionics on some of the older aircraft, and they're only getting better. So no matter what you're flying, applying these principles of understanding how to load the full procedure, how to activate a leg in the procedure, makes using your avionics very simple. And it gives you so many options when you're working with air traffic control. Okay, so if you do have any questions about how we flew the procedure, or how you would fly the procedure, or about the course itself, we've got our phone number up at the top. You can call or send us a text message. Of course, you can always send us an email. And one of the biggest questions we get is, how long do you have access for? It is a one-time purchase with lifetime access. All of our courses work like that. The other big question we get is, what do they work on? They work cross-platform. So you can use them on your PC, on your Mac, on your Chromebook, all through a web browser. We also have dedicated iOS apps for iPad and iPhone. We've got a Mac app, and we have Apple TV apps as well that let you use the course and download the videos. And of course, if the course isn't a right fit, no big deal. We've got a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you're ready to get started, we have an Add to Cart button down below. And if you want to see all of the content that's in the course, we have links to the instructor and student guides as well. Okay, so we do have one more video coming out tomorrow, but that is a surprise. In the meantime, I'm really excited to hear what you think of this course.